Good afternoon. On behalf of the Asian Institute of International Financial Law, AIIFL, I'd like to extend our warmest welcome for you to join AIIFL's webinar on AI, technology, and personal data protection. My name is Emily Lee. I'm the director of AIIFL, which is housed at the University of Hong Kong Faculty of Law. It gives me great pleasure, and it is indeed an honor and privilege for me to introduce our very distinguished speakers and commentator today. The first speaker, Mr. Ada Chon, is the Privacy Commissioner for Personal Data in Hong Kong. She was appointed to the role in September 2020. Ms. Chon was qualified as a barrister at law and a certified public accountant. She has solid legal expertise and abundant administrative experience. Before her appointment as the Privacy Commissioner for Personal Data, Ms. Chon was the Registrar of Companies and had held various posts in the Department of Justice, including the Deputy Law Officer, Civil Law. In her role as the Registrar of Companies, she contributed significantly to the rewrite of the Companies Ordinance, and she spearheaded the implementation of the new Companies Ordinance in Hong Kong. In addition to her contribution to public services, Ada is also a member of AIIFL's Professional Advisory Board. She has been a staunch supporter of AIIFL since she was the Registrar of Companies. We owe her a great debt of gratitude. Without her, today's event will not be possible. The second speaker, Mr. Yong Zi King, is Assistant Chief Executive, Data Innovation and Protection Group of the Infocom Media Development Authority of Singapore, IMDA, and Deputy Commissioner of the Personal Data Protection Commission, PDPC. In his capacity as Assistant Chief Executive, Data Innovation and Protection Group, Ziking oversees IMDA's artificial intelligence and data industry development strategy. This is one of 4 frontier technology areas IMDA has identified for its transformational potential for a digital economy. The other 3 are cybersecurity, the Internet of Things, and immersive media. In his role as an AI and data analytics champion, Ziking's work includes developing forward-thinking governance on AI and data, driving a pipeline of AI talent, promoting industry adoption of AI and data analytics, as well as building specific AI and data science capabilities in Singapore. The commentator today is Mr. Arthur Yuan. He is Deputy Chief Executive of the Hong Kong Monetary Authority, HKMA. Mr. Yuan is in charge of the full range of banking policy, supervision, conduct, and enforcement issues at the HKMA. He joined the HKMA in 1996 as head of administration and has since taken up different responsibilities, including research and liaison on China economic and market development issues before being appointed head of banking supervision in 2000. He took up the position as Executive Director, Banking Development in July 2004, Executive Director, Banking Supervision in June 2005, and Executive Director, External in July 2008. He was appointed to his present position in January 2010. Without further ado, I now pass the floor to Ms. Ada Chon, the first speaker. Over to you, Ada. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Emily, for the kind introduction. Emily, Ziking, Arthur, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. And thank you very much for Emily's invitation. I'm very happy here today to talk to you on a very important and interesting topic, the ethical development and use of artificial intelligence, AI. First and foremost, what is artificial intelligence, AI? For those of you who care to search for the term on the internet, I think you will have a whole series of definitions given to you from different sources. Indeed, up to this moment, there is no one single agreed definition for AI, and the term has been defined differently in different literatures. I've tried to put a general description here on this slide. And very broadly, I would say that AI refers to technologies that involve the use of computer programs and machines to mimic the problem-solving or decision-making capabilities of human beings. And I have put here several examples of AI applications. They include facial recognition, speech recognition, chatbots, data analytics, and automated decision-making or recommendations. As AI technologies evolve day by day, I think it is clear that more and more new applications are likely to emerge, and AI applications will be applied in many, many areas, or I would say in a variety of areas that affect our daily lives in the years to come. Let me give you one example of AI, facial recognition. How does it work? Basically, facial recognition is a program that captures the face of a target person. The program then analyzes and records distinguishable features or landmarks of the face, and we call them nodal points on the human face. According to some studies, there are about 80 to 90 nodal points on a human face. And after all these nodal points are located, the program will convert the location of the nodal points into numerical data to formulate a unique facial template. And there are two methods of comparison. Basically, the template will be formed by measurements between the nodal points. For example, the distance between the two eyes, the distance or the angle between the eyes and the tip of the nose, the shape of the mouth, and the shape of the jaws, etc. And after all these are identified, the nodal points will be located. The program then will convert them into numerical data, and a template will be formed. Then there are two means of comparison. Either it's a one-to-one comparison or it is a one-to-many comparison. By one-to-one comparison, the program will compare the face of a particular person, say Mr. A, to the facial template of Mr. A to check whether he is indeed Mr. A. And for one-to-many comparisons, the program will compare, say, a facial template with other facial templates in the database to ascertain or identify the target person in question and to ascertain his identity. So that is how facial recognition works by means of AI. Increasing use of AI with rapid technological developments, I think all of you are aware that AI is gaining popularity both in Hong Kong and in overseas jurisdictions. And while AI has enormous potential to boost productivity and economic growth, it also brought with it privacy and ethical risks, which we cannot ignore. Globally, there have been discussions on whether we should regulate the development and use of AI and how we should regulate it, whether it should be by legislative means or by other means, such as by the promulgation of guidelines or best practices. And a consensus on the matter is yet to be formed. Potential values of AI. Indeed, the potential values of AI have been recognized by different studies and researchers over the years. I have put down two examples here. Last year, Google carried out a study and it showed that around 80% of Hong Kong businesses believe that AI is beneficial, and over 60% of Hong Kong businesses expect to increase their investment in AI in future. In terms of economic growth, a research conducted by PwC showed that global GDP will be 14% higher in 2030, about 10 years from now, as a net effect of using AI. And it is mainly driven by enhanced productivity because of the use of AI and better personalization and improved quality of services and products. Use of AI in the financial sector of Hong Kong. In 2019, according to a global survey conducted by McKinsey, over 60% of the respondents in the financial sector have applied at least one AI capability in their operations. And in 2019, about 2 years ago, the Hong Kong MA reported that about 90% of surveyed retail banks in Hong Kong adopted or plan to adopt AI applications. And I believe that this percentage has increased nowadays because of the existence of virtual banking. And I believe that for virtual banks, AI applications would represent the life and blood for them. And for as recently as last month, in October, the Hong Kong Academy of Finance published a research report which suggested that over 70% of surveyed financial services companies in the Asia-Pacific region adopted or plan to adopt AI and big data technologies in the next 12 months. From all these research and survey results, that is clearly an unprecedented demand for AI. For the past 10 years, we have witnessed the ICT revolution with our lives transformed by, for example, the use of iPhones and increasing use of the social media. For the next 10 years, I envisage that it will be the era of AI. And that is why AI is nowadays a very important topic. Notwithstanding all these advantages and benefits of using AI, we need to note that from time to time, the decisions made by AI may be inaccurate, biased, or even unfair. Back in 2018, from a study carried out by MIT, they identified 3 facial recognition programs, which showed a consistently higher error rate for identification of dark-skinned women. Why is that? This is basically because for the machine learning process, for the development of the AI in question, the database or the training data consisted of a very small sample of dark-skinned women. That is why it has led to higher error rate for identification of dark-skinned women. And separately, the AI recruitment program developed by Amazon was also accused of favoring male candidates to female candidates because of its male-dominated training data. Essentially, this illustrates the point that the accuracy and the size, the sample size of the training data is very important when it comes to AI. And I will explain this in greater depth later. Metaverse. Everyone is getting excited about Metaverse nowadays. And that's why I think I should cover this particular subject in this presentation as well. With the development of Metaverse, is the problem getting better or worse? I think this is a very important topic which we should consider and think about in the years to come. There's always huge amount of excitement by Metaverse. about the development of Metaverse by, for example, wealthy investors or the big tech giants. And Metaverse, is it the next big thing? It is widely described as the future of internet or the next chapter of internet. And what is Metaverse? I think it is very difficult to arrive at one single definition of Metaverse at the moment, because the concept is still a very new and developing concept. And I have tried to consolidate materials from different sources in coming up with this description on the slide. Very roughly, I would say Metaverse refers to a highly immersive in the sense that it is, you participate in the virtual world. It is a highly immersive virtual world where people gather together to communicate, to work, and to play in shared virtual spaces with the aid of AI-powered avatars. And with the support from other technologies, such as augmented reality, AR, virtual reality, VR, or even mixed reality, MR, it is envisaged that there will be a hyper-real alternative world for people to live in as the Metaverse expands. And it is the potential of Metaverse. And that is why it is a growth rush by businesses, big or small, to develop a business model around the concept. However, with Metaverse, will privacy risks persist, get better, or even worse? I've highlighted 3 possible privacy risks on this slide. First of all, excessive collection of data. Will there be excessive collection of data? Especially when we put more advanced equipment and sensors in our homes and workplaces for replicating our actions, for the creation of these AI-powered avatars. Secondly, as users are immersing themselves in the Metaverse, are they giving up more to live in the digital world? For example, are they giving up more of their personal data, especially sensitive personal data, such as biometric personal data, location data, or even banking information? Remember that you can conduct your banking business in the Metaverse. You can meet your customer relations manager in the Metaverse and create or open an account in the Metaverse. All this involves data. Will there be more data profiling happening in the Metaverse? In addition, personal data may become more susceptible to being copied, stolen, erased, or manipulated. Would this happen more frequently in Metaverse when compared to the real world? I think these are all very challenging questions and difficult questions for us to answer. But I would like people to bear this in mind when they discuss the potential and the benefits brought about by Metaverse in the years to come. Let us turn to basics, the impact of AI on data privacy. You may ask, why is AI related to data? Why is AI relevant to the privacy commissioners or the data protection commissioners? You got 2 commissioners here, one from Hong Kong, one from Singapore, and both of us are talking about AI and data. The simple answer is that data is the lifeblood of AI, artificial intelligence. To develop or to create the intelligence, we need to feed large amount of data, including personal data, big data, into the machine learning process in order to create or to develop or to improve the intelligence. And it is how the intelligence is developed or created. And I have set out on this slide on the right-hand side some possible impacts on privacy as a result of the process: excessive collection and retention of data, lack of transparency, unpredictable use, people may find it difficult to interpret the algorithms. At the end of the day, they become so much more sophisticated and so much more complicated that the use of the data may be beyond human comprehension. Bias and discrimination, I've already mentioned that a minute ago. Re-identification. What is re-identification? That basically means that the AI model is so clever, so intelligent, that it is able to re-identify by collating and matching data from different sources to re-identify the identity of a particular person, which basically negates or undermines the security of anonymous data. Because very often when we use data in the AI process, in the machine learning process, we will feed in anonymous data. However, the AI is so intelligent, you can re-identify the individual in question. And this poses a risk of data privacy. I've tried to sum up the privacy risk by this slide by highlighting the 4 data protection principles which are being challenged by the adoption of AI. And they are data minimization, data accuracy, transparency, purpose specification, and limitation of use. Purpose specification basically means that data should only be used for the purpose for which they are collected, and they should not be used for other purposes. However, with AI, with the development of complicated and sophisticated algorithms, sometimes, and I think it is really from time to time, data can be used for a purpose which is totally beyond human comprehension. And it is basically because the logic involved in the development of AI is getting so much more sophisticated nowadays that sometimes the results produced by this particular machine learning process is totally beyond our comprehension. And this poses a risk to data protection. I have tried to show you the international efforts on promoting ethical AI on this slide. You see that, for example, in 2019, both Singapore and Japan have published either AI governance framework or social principles. Actually, for the past few years, since 2018, international organizations like the Global Privacy Assembly, the European Commission, the OECD, and the UNESCO, they have all published either declarations, guidelines, or principles on the ethical development of AI. And the recent study shows that at the moment, there are over 160 sets of AI principles published by various organizations worldwide. Back in Hong Kong, the Hong Kong MA has issued a set of high-level principles on AI in 2019. And last August, my office has published a guidance on the ethical development and use of AI. With this guidance, we hope that we will be in a position to assist organizations to develop and use AI in compliance with the requirements of the privacy law, namely the Personal Data Privacy Ordinance of Hong Kong. And also we will be able to assist them to use AI in an ethical manner. I believe that if we facilitate a healthy development and use of AI in Hong Kong, that would enable us to move a step closer to become an innovation and technology hub and also a world-class smart city. Our guidance basically promulgates 3 data stewardship values and 7 ethical principles, and I will talk about them one by one. For the 3 stewardship values, they are the first or the starting point, I would say, for the formulation of policies and principles for the development and use of AI. And they are being respectful, being beneficial, and being fair to stakeholders. The value of being respectful to stakeholders highlights the importance of the rights, interests, and reasonable expectations of stakeholders. And stakeholders, including individuals, should be treated ethically. They should not be treated as just a piece of data. Being beneficial means that the AI system should provide benefits to stakeholders and minimize the harm caused to stakeholders. And being fair basically means that bias and discrimination should be avoided. If there's any differential treatment between individuals or between groups of individuals, that should be supported by the sound reasons, and that should be justifiable. Expanding from the free data stewardship values, we have developed or promulgated 7 ethical principles. And remember that these principles are in line with international standards. The first principle is accountability. Basically, it means that organizations should be responsible for their actions and should be responsible for the adoption of AI. They should be able to provide sound justifications for actions. And for human oversight, we recommend that organizations should keep the level of human involvement proportional to the risk and impact of using AI. And we also recommend organizations to adopt a risk-based approach in the determination of the appropriate level of human oversight. And I will try to explain this by illustration of, using a graph later on in the presentation. The third principle is transparency and interpretability. Organizations should disclose their use of AI and relevant policies. And we also recommend organizations to strive to improve the explainability of automated or AI-assisted decisions. For the fourth principle of data privacy, it basically means that organizations should protect personal data privacy by putting in place effective governance structure, and personal data should also be processed and also handled in accordance with the legal requirements. The fifth and the sixth principles are the principles of fairness and beneficial AI, and they reflect the 2 data stewardship values of being fair and being beneficial, and I have already explained them. The seventh and the last principle is reliability, robustness, and security, and this relates to the security of the AI system. And in the guidance, we recommend that AI systems should operate reliably, should be resilient to errors, and should be protected against attacks to prevent data leaks, data poisoning, or even unintentional harms. So much for the 7 ethical principles. I will now move on to the practice guide, which is a major part of our guidance. The practice guide has been included in the guidance so that organizations can apply the data stewardship values and principles in their practical business operations. And that is why we have structured the practice guide on the basis of 4 major business processes. The practice guide consists of 4 processes. The first one is to establish AI strategy and governance. The second one is to carry out risk assessment and human oversight. And the third one is to execute the development of AI models and the management of AI systems. This relates to the core function of the AI system, developing the model and also management of the system. And the fourth process relates to fostering communication and engagement with stakeholders. And after you have the feedback from stakeholders, we also recommend organizations to fine-tune the AI systems to address stakeholders' concerns. For example, for a bank, for example, if you are adopting an AI system to assess the credit rating assessment of customers, if the customers provide feedback to you saying that the system is inaccurate in a certain aspect, then you should review the system, fine-tune the system if necessary to address the customer's concern. We also recommend organizations to reassess the risk regularly, especially when there are significant changes in, for example, the regulatory environment, or when there are significant changes in the operation of the AI. I will talk about the business processes one by one. The first one is to establish the AI strategy and governance. We recommend that organizations should set up an internal governance structure to steer the development and use of AI within the organization. They should establish an organizational level AI strategy and an AI governance committee, which consisted of the participation of senior management. Expertise in different fields, for example, computer engineering, cybersecurity, compliance, legal or public relations are required for the governance structure. And the governance committee should be responsible for overseeing the execution of the AI strategy within the organization. The committee should also ensure adequate training is provided to staff on the adoption of AI in the operation of the organization. Secondly, we recommend organizations to carry out an early and comprehensive risk assessment in order to adopt appropriate risk mitigation measures and to decide on the appropriate level of human oversight. Even though it is an AI system, this does not mean that human involvement or human oversight is unnecessary. I'll try to illustrate this by means of a graph here. If the risk level is high, we will recommend organizations to adopt a human-in-the-loop approach. Remember that AI should serve human beings. It should not be the other way around. So if the risk level is high, we should adopt a human-in-the-loop approach, meaning that human actors should retain control in the decision-making process to prevent any errors or inaccurate or improper decisions by the AI system. However, if the risk is low, and it is at the lower end of the graph, then we can adopt a human out of the loop approach, which basically means that the AI can make decisions without human intervention, thus achieving fully automated decision-making. So basically, we advocate that organizations should adopt a risk-based approach to human oversight. For the third business process, we have broken it down into 3 stages: data preparation, model development, ongoing monitoring and management. And we highlighted the importance of, for example, ensuring compliance with relevant data protection laws, such as the privacy law, choosing the right algorithms, testing the AI models before use, and ongoing monitoring of the AI system and adjustment of the AI strategy whenever necessary. So this relates to the core operation or core functioning of the AI system. The fourth or the last business process is fostering communication and engagement with stakeholders. And on communication and engagement, we emphasize transparency. Transparency is important because we encourage organizations to disclose the use of and the risk of AI systems to relevant stakeholders, and including its customers, in order to gain the trust from customers. Organizations should also provide adequate information to customers. On engagement, organizations should provide for channels of communications with stakeholders and allow customers to opt out from automated decisions, allow them to correct inaccuracies, and they should also be provided with an option of human intervention. Customers should also be given the right to ask for explanation. Why is that important? Because trust from customers is essential for the adoption of successful AI. For example, if the customer of a bank wishes to opt out from an assessment made by the AI on his credit rating, we encourage organizations to allow for the opt-out option so that the customer can receive human assessment of his credit rating. That is the idea and the recommendation contained in this particular guidance. The way forward, I would say that indeed we have a long way to go to promote the ethical use of AI. As I have said, in 2019, the Hong Kong MA has published the high-level principles on artificial intelligence. Almost at the same time as my office published the guidance, the OGIO, the Office of the Government Chief Information Officer, also published an ethical AI framework for use by government departments. And given the increasing popularity of AI, my office will continue with our work to raise awareness of the ethical use of AI, both locally and internationally. We have just organized several public webinars on AI, and we have also participated in several roundtable events and research projects in this area. Internationally, we contribute to the work of the AI Working Group of the Global Privacy Assembly, and we have plans to collaborate with our Singapore counterpart, with Commissioner Yong, in the production of more reference materials for the reference by business community, both in Hong Kong and in Singapore. And last but not least, I envisage that there will be more and more discussion on whether the development of AI should be regulated and how we should regulate it, whether it is by legislative means or by other means. So we will try to keep track on the international development in this area, and we will also take into account the local situation in order to decide on the best way forward for Hong Kong. With that, I've come to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. Over to you, Emily.
I was controlled actually by the control panel. So they just restored the system for me. I was actually very attentive of your lecture. Thank you, Ada, for the very informative and comprehensive coverage of the topic on AI and data governance. You have covered quite a few. The existing and potential AI applications, be the close connection between AI and personal data governance, including why and how, as well as the use cases of AI that concern use and consumption of personal data, atop the step-by-step, very useful guide for the implementation of the specific principles underlying the guidance on the ethical development and use of artificial intelligence issued by your office, the PCPD. Thank you very much for sharing your insights. May I pass the floor to the second speaker today, our Singapore regulator. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Commissioner Chung and Dr. Lee, for this invitation for me to participate and share Singapore's approach to AI governance. As Commissioner Chung mentioned, we started on this journey a couple of years ago. And one of the things that I would like to preface is to actually say that this is one area where, even though we may have say 160 different sets of principles, right? There is actually a large, there's actually quite a lot of convergence. So there are a lot of similarities, and it is actually good. It's rare, but it is actually a good development because it makes it a lot easier for us, especially for those of us who operate in multinational companies, to be able to put in place internal compliance programs that then can very easily be adapted for different jurisdictions, because that's actually how a lot of our products and services will end up being deployed. Centrally researched, but then deployed to different markets, but from a common base. Next slide, please. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a step back and provide a bit of a overview of how we see our model AI governance framework and the various resources that we have put out fitting within a national AI strategy. So I would say that what we've done is actually we have taken the principles, we have adapted the principles to pursue and support a very specific strategy. And in Singapore, what we've done is actually articulated a national strategy that is weighted towards deployment and implementation of AI systems across the economy to support competitiveness and to support economic growth. Our national AI strategy articulates two big ambitions. One, there are 5 national AI projects that have been identified to kind of like show the way and to really give a big push ahead, right, in the adoption of AI through government leading some of these demand, leading some of these examples, right? Showcases in transport and logistics, smart cities and estates, healthcare, education, safety and security. This is not the only thing that's done. What is also being done is also to ensure that for private sector business use cases, we also support their adoption. So while the government pushes to showcase and lead by example, the private sector is also supported. And for the private sector, ecosystem enablers are absolutely crucial. We will continue on what we call the triple helix relationship between government, private sector, and research institutions to make sure that AI research gets into the hands of businesses and consumers quickly. We need to ensure that there is sufficient program to train AI talents and to educate. And this focuses not only on the engineers who work with AI, but also on a broader awareness program such that business managers and average workers like you and me, right, will understand the benefits, right, and the strategic importance of AI. Data architecture, that one, I think I won't have to repeat the importance of good quality data, good data standards, because without good quality data and good data standards, it is you compound the challenges in working with data to train AI machine learning models. We of course want to make sure that there is a progressive and trusted environment, and that's where I will dive deeper into, because that's the role that the AI governance framework plays. And just quickly round off the last area, which is international collaboration, how we might be able to plug into international discussions, for example, like the Global Partnership for AI, like the work in the OECD network of experts on AI, to see how we can learn and how we can also contribute to the global discussion. Next slide, please. So basically, one of the things that motivated us to take this step, right, to focus on providing a framework to drive the need to build consumer trust and responsible use of data for AI is really those the preoccupation, perhaps, right, a few years ago, especially, where there were frequent discussions in public media about how mistakes in the selection of a data set for training AI were made, resulting in discriminatory decisions at the end. Mistakes that were made in the handling of data that results in data breaches, or sometimes actually assumptions were made in the use of AI. For example, using publicly available facial images to train AI models, which were then used for security applications, right? The use case was actually alarming, and that caused issues. So there were several types of issues that actually chipped away at consumer trust, right, in the companies that put out the systems and in the companies that were using data. So that's why we thought that it was necessary to take well-established principles in data protection around accountability, around data governance, right, and around transparency and consumer communication, and to put it in a framework that helps organizations apply these principles when they are using AI. Next slide, please. So the approach that we took is really to focus on providing the framework and providing the tools to assist good responsible use, supporting the data protection officer, supporting the teams working on the AI testing, right, and supporting the compliance officers. Our journey was that we put out a discussion paper. We had one version of the framework that was issued in 2019 that attracted a bit of attention, and companies came and used it and tested with us. And very quickly, early last year, we put out a second version that took on board the inputs, right, to enhance the framework. So the framework provides that guidance, right? We also knew that it is absolutely important at this stage of AI deployment that we focus on providing good examples and handy practical tools to help companies who want to implement the framework. So our next area of focus was to put together a self-assessment guide, right? A list of questionnaires that we developed together with the World Economic Forum that will help organizations go through, right, the questionnaire, go through the assessment questions to give them the assurance that they have not missed out anything, or if they do want to skip certain steps, it is something that's very conscious and something very deliberate. The other thing is that we put together 2 compendiums of use cases. So these, we were very fortunate. We had companies, both multinationals as well as startups, foreign as well as domestic, who were prepared to say, this is how we are doing it in our company, and we think that this is a good illustration of either the whole of your framework or certain parts of your framework. So we've managed to bring together companies to do that. So our emphasis really is to show, to give confidence by providing real-world use case, familiar names, examples, provide the tools to help implement. Next slide, please. The other approach that I want to highlight, the other feature of our approach that we want to highlight is that AI is one of those technologies which, while it is a horizontal technology, it appears in different vertical sectors. Many of us who are practitioners in this area will know that a lot of these AI models are open source, and the functions that they perform are, you break it down, is one of 2 or 3 functions, right? Clustering or classification, right? But the key thing is, what's the data that you bring to train it, and what's the purpose that you're training it for? So even as we design our governance framework, we were very conscious to work together with sectoral regulators. So the way we looked at it is our governance framework provides that horizontal sort of principles that will be applicable to all sectors, to all organizations. But we work with, for example, the Monetary Authority of Singapore to make sure that their feed principles will work well together with our Model AI governance framework. We are currently working together with our Ministry of Health to make sure that the specific requirements when you're using AI in healthcare, right, will also be able to work well with our Model AI governance framework. And apart from these 2, there are 2 or 3 other sectors that we're working with, right, to take a similar approach. So this allows us to provide a fairly uniform approach across all sectors while working with sector agencies to fine-tune and make specific adjustments that are required for sector use cases. Next slide, please. So what exactly is our framework all about? I would say that I would just write on what Commissioner Chung has gone through, because the contents are fairly similar, right? For us, we believe that when we talk about AI principles and all that, right, There are two big groups. There's one group which is of general application, not just to AI, but technology generally, right? Beneficence, for example, fairness and all that, right? But there are certain principles that are unique and specific to AI, right? So we kind of like make sure that we embed and entrench those when you implement the framework. Essentially, by implementing the framework, you're able to achieve two sets of principles. One, to ensure that the AI system that you're using when you are using it to support decision making, especially, right? The decision will be explainable. There will be transparent processes, and the data that you're using, right, and the result that comes out of it will be fair. The other is that when you are designing AI systems, it should be human-centric, and it should be fair on the individuals as well. We cluster these recommendations into 4 areas. One around internal governance structures and processes. I don't want to go into the details of each of these 4, but just really highlight a few key things. For example, internal governance structures and measures. The reason why we place great emphasis here is that the direction and the decisions must come from the top. The choice to deploy AI at scale in products and services, or even within operations, should be taken at the right level of management, because that's where corporate accountability and corporate responsibility begins. But we do say that while we recommend setting up, for example, AI ethics board, where the scale of the deployment requires it, many times for many companies, look at your existing governance structures and see whether you can use one of them and give them this additional task to make sure that someone at the right level is making these decisions and making these decisions on behalf of the organization, because that's where a corporate responsibility begins. When we move over to the design of systems, right? Similar to what Commissioner Chung mentioned, is the human involvement. The level of human involvement is absolutely crucial. We don't use a graph, we use a 2x2 matrix, but roughly it's the same thing, right? The impact of the risk and the likelihood of the risk. And we give some guidance on deciding when you can use human out of the loop, when do you need to use human over the loop, and when you need to use human in the loop, right? Because the design decisions are actually important when we talk about corporate responsibility. The next area is, of course, what we call operations management. Sometimes I think we can have a better word for it, but essentially it's around data. Where are you getting the data from? Is it good quality, representative data, recent data? Is the data pre-processed to the right extent so that it is effective for your model training? Do you have a good practice of segregating training and testing data sets? Do you have sufficient data to do de-biasing and testing? When you deploy your trained model, how do you select the right model to deploy? Do you put in place measures to monitor the deployed model for performance, to make sure that it's performing to the right benchmarks, and whether the performance degrades over time? So these are important aspects around data and the deployed model that we built into the framework as well. Finally, I think perhaps one of the key things really is around the stakeholder interaction and communication. So here we try to provide some guidance on explainability in action. What do I mean by that? We say identify who the target recipients of the information is. It could be a B2B interaction, so it could be a solution provider providing information to the company that's actually using the data. It could be a B2C context, where it's the company providing information to the consumer and the end user. Be clear about who the target audience is. Second, be clear about the stage of your relationship that you are providing the information. So to use a B2C example, you might want to provide certain information at the early stage of your B2C relationship to try and get an interested consumer to find out more about your product, right? How it uses AI, how it uses data, so that you can convert an interested consumer into a customer. When you have the customer on board and the customer is using the data, using your product and services, then you might need to craft your information strategy, right, differently. This is where sometimes explainability comes in. Are you providing sufficient information about how your product feature works? Are you providing sufficient controls in your product, right, to allow inform the consumer? So, for example, it is because of certain browsing habits or certain viewing habits of yours in your history, that is why certain recommendations are being made to you now. That's good, useful information. It educates the consumer, right? Educates the customer. And are you providing sufficient features for the customer to make adjustments to that? So, for example, some tools allow you to say, oh, please do not use certain items in my browsing or viewing history to make recommendations, right? And then they allow you to make a deletion from that. So that's the second stage. The third stage, right? It could well be, again, depending on the product, right? You might have made a certain decision that might affect the customer, right? So in the context of a insurance policy, for example, insurance claim was automatically approved, or it could have been rejected. Are you then providing sufficient information to empower the customer to understand the effects, right? What data was used, how it influenced the result, and are you providing sufficient information about how the customer may challenge a particular decision? So that's kind of like how we put establish accountability, data management, and consumer communication principles into a comprehensive framework that allows companies to implement within the organization. Next slide, please. We are moving beyond the framework and moving into a new area. We just started it earlier this year, which is that it's well and fine to talk about having a framework, providing the practical tools, right, and providing examples. We see a global trend towards being able to say that not only do I comply with these principles, I want to be able to prove to you objectively that I have got these good practices in place. Some discussions are around process audits. But in the area of AI, we have discovered that you can have a combination of process audits as well as objective testing. So we are in the process of developing a testing framework, right? This is divided into these 4 broad areas. Actually, if you look at the description of the 4 broad areas and the principles that are in there, again, there is a lot of convergence in the global principles around this area. Nothing you see here will be particularly new or astonishing. It's really identifying for each of them. How might we document a process so that you're able, for example, to provide proof that you have got good quality data and your process of testing, right, has been robust. For certain areas, like for example, fairness, right? It is possible to run some objective tests around bias, right? So how do you run those tests, and how do you prove that you've run those tests sufficiently? The process of developing it, we'll be happy to share more about it as we have more details available. Next slide, please. I want to next slide, please. Yes. Okay. So I want to just spend the last couple of minutes, right, of my sharing to bring these concepts back to data protection law. And what I wanted to say is that one of the things that we did when we were reviewing our Personal Data Protection Act last year was to see how data is actually used, right? Particularly in new areas like AI, and to see whether we are able to build into our data protection principles the regulatory clarity and support that we can provide companies who are working in this area. And the kind of things, the two big things that we did was really to see a fundamental segregation between use of data in the development of AI products and services, and then the deployment and application of the AI in a real-world environment. For the use of data to support developments, one of the things that we did was to talk to the industry. Basically, in the end, what we did was that we crafted a business improvement exception that basically essentially say that if you're using data to improve and enhance business processes, right, it is a legitimate purpose, and you can do so without need for explicit consent, provided you comply with some safeguards, right? So we kind of crafted that. The key thing for this is really to understand that one, right, especially for AI, and I'll just contextualize my comments around AI. One, for the training of AI, right, the training of AI frequently don't require identifiable personal data. You can de-identify, you can anonymize, right? You can work with that for training. But we also realized at some point, for example, when you need to do bias testing, when you need to do de-biasing, right? You might actually need to use identifiable data. So these are some of the areas that we try to clarify to provide that clarity. You're able to use data in a certain way for training, but if you need to use it in an identifiable form in order to perform some of these functions, we want to provide that clarity. But once you are done with the training, the use of data for training, and your model is ready for deployment, and you embed it in your product and services, and you start deploying it in real-world environment, then we have a different set of challenges. Because when you deploy it as a product and service, and customers start using it, it will function on the input data, right? So the earlier example I used about recommendation engine, it requires the use of an individual's browsing history, an individual's viewing history to be able to perform provide those recommendations. So this is where you might need consent, right? You might need the customer's consent and acknowledgement. But then there are certain other situations where you cannot depend on consent. So for example, in many of them in financial and even in corporate situation, anomaly detection for the purpose of detecting fraudulent behavior. You can't depend on consent, right? Because you need all the data on board. And other examples would be when you're deploying some of these for security application. Again, you cannot depend on consent. So we introduce a legitimate interest as a basis for use of this kind of technology and the use of data in this kind of application when we were amending our Personal Data Protection Act. So I wanted to just kind of like bring the discussion back and anchor it on how personal data sometimes need to be used, and sometimes you can actually rely on anonymized or de-identified data. Next slide, please. So I will conclude by basically just sharing that we believe that AI is one of those technologies that is still emergent. The way we are using it will continue to evolve. So what we hope to be able to do is really work in partnership with stakeholders within Singapore, with collaborators in Hong Kong and other parts of the world as well, right? Because this is something that we need to find a way that works, right? Not just domestically, but actually works in a consistent manner, in an interoperable manner across jurisdiction. The second thing is actually we are very much focused on the practicality. I usually run away from discussions around regulation because you know, as the regulator in me says that, yeah, it's easy enough to think about what needs to be regulated, but when you have to start enforcing, do we have the tools and do we have the benchmarks that we need? At this point in time for AI, I don't think so. Those are still being developed. So let's take a practical approach and let's develop those industry benchmarks. Let's develop those tools so that we are ready to introduce regulation when we need to. But having said that, that doesn't mean that we ignore the need for regulation. We need to think through as well, because policy making and for regulation actually takes a long time. And finally, what we hope to be able to do is to see how we can actually plug into global networks and work and participate right in the global discussion for this. So I thank you for the opportunity for me to share, and I'll be happy to deal with some any questions that we may have during the Q&A later.
Thank you, Ziking. You mentioned that there are 161 principles under Singapore's AI and data protection framework. It is amazing how you managed to break it down into bite sizes for the education of the general public. It is both a science and an art, and you have made it accessible for us. I actually have taken down notes, but in the interest of time, I think I'll just pass it on to Arthur now. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Emily. I hope you're hearing me clearly.
Yes.
So thanks for inviting me to be the commentator for this session. I know that we are running sort of slightly behind schedule. So let me try to be as quick as I can in summarizing my comments, and then still leave a little bit of time towards the end for discussion. So I think it's like me, the audience would have benefited a lot from the sharing by Ada and Ziking. In terms of providing a framework for thinking about the issue of data privacy and data protection in the context of artificial intelligence and machine learning. From my perspective, I think there are two very core lessons that I can sort of distill from their presentations. The first one is really, if I may paraphrase what Ada mentioned in her presentation, in the earlier part of the presentation, what AI is about is really to mimic the problem solving and the task handling capability of the human minds, although substantially enhanced in that process. But at the end of the day, it's still the processing of a lot of data in order to enhance the way we make decisions and enhance the way we process some of the tasks like credit risk analysis in the context of a financial firm. But what sets artificial intelligence apart from the traditional way of looking at personal data protection and personal data privacy is really, I'm sure the audience would know that traditionally the way we look at data privacy and data protection is to look at two parameters, basically. One is scope of data collected, and secondly, the usage of those data, whether they are used for the purpose that they are collected. So two very simple and easy to administer parameters. So we shouldn't collect, we shouldn't over collect data. And if we are collecting certain data, we better use it for the purpose that was stated. In some jurisdictions, they have actually moved on in the past few years to a third parameter called data ownership, like GDPR in Europe. But by and large, I think scope and usage is still the driving force behind personal data privacy and ownership. Now, what complicates the landscape when it comes to AI and machine learning is that there is a deep learning process in between the collection and the usage. And therefore, there will be engines trying to slice and dice data in different ways, looking at a deep pool of data to look for traits, behavioral traits like debt repayment, sort of intentional capabilities. And that learning process is actually self-feeding so that it continues to perfect the engine as we go along. Now, that learning process quite significantly complicated the landscape for data privacy and data protection, because it's not only about the data or the usage anymore, it's also about processing in between. So that's the first lesson that I can distill from the presentation. Now, the second lesson that I can learn from the presentation is actually a derivation of the first one, because we're not focusing on the data collection and the data usage only. What else do we focus on in terms of governing the in-between process of learning, analytical processes, and the ongoing evolution of data points. I can distill 3 broad principles. Actually, Seekin didn't show the last of his slides. The last of his slides is actually a thank you slide showing Marina Bay Sands with 3 blocks with the towel on top. I think that's a very good explanation of what we are facing right now. There are 3 pillars that I can distill from what they said. One pillar I would call governance and accountability. The second pillar is explainability and fairness. The third pillar is transparency. And on top of all that is data privacy and data protection. So Marina Bay Sands, our Singaporean friends, has been very good in building that thing, which I've used on numerous occasions in presenting 3 pillars or 3 principles that we should be sort of subjected to. Now, I am a banking supervisor, so maybe I would just use the next 5 minutes or so to tell you what I see as a banking supervisor. When I apply those principles in the context of banking supervision, what does it mean in practice? I think from my vantage point as a banking supervisor, really, there are 2 big clusters of issues that we need to grapple with when it comes to artificial intelligence and machine learning. The first big cluster of issues or big cluster of principles that we need to sort of sort out is related to risk management of banks. Now, traditionally, data protection and data privacy falls into the areas of legal risk management and operational risk management of banks. In the brave new world of AIs and machine learning, still pretty much operational risk and legal risk. But I think given the complexity of the issues involved, like the ongoing learning process, the model design, and the data input issues that we are facing with, that we're faced with, I think it's fair for us to highlight one new area of risk when it comes to banking supervision, is what we call AI model risk. So in the AI model risk areas, there are several aspects that we are looking at particularly. The first aspect is capacity and model quality. So the capacity meaning whether those people developing the AI engines has the requisite competence and experience in developing those engines. And whether the model that they developed is of sufficient quality to ensure that the outcome is reasonable. The second area of risk that we'll be facing with in terms of these model risks is what we call data quality risk. I think both Ada and Seekin mentioned that the concept of training the engine, because before we even start a production run for the AI engines, you will need to train the engine by dumping in a lot of data so that the machine would start learning and perfecting the outcomes that comes out from the engine. So if you didn't train it properly, you would end up with with outcome bias that Seekin mentioned in his presentation. And on an ongoing basis, you will need to enrich the reliability of outcome by dumping in further data points to ongoing review the outcome. And for the engine to ongoing learn the possible changes in data structure, for example, or the behavioral structure of the target audience. And therefore, data quality becomes a big area of challenge that we need to ensure that banks are properly managing when it comes to model risk. The third area of risk is cyber, because it is highly technical, it's highly data and model and analytical model driven sort of operations, and therefore cyber risk becomes a very significant risk that banks need to effectively deal with. And finally, what we call incident response and contingency planning risk, because very often when it comes to application of AIs and machine learning, it becomes a kind of a single point of failure. If you don't have the engine anymore, then potentially the banks will not know how to deal with that processes, and therefore banks will need contingency arrangements in place just in case they find that things have changed in such a way that the model outcome is no longer reliable. What do you fall back to? So that incident response and contingency risk is important in the model risk area. So that's the first big cluster of issues that we deal with in terms of risk management. The second big cluster of issues that we deal with is consumer protection. And there we have several aspects, pretty much in line with what I've mentioned in terms of 3 pillars and data protection principles. First and foremost is governance and accountability. In our language, a bank can shift the processing from human to engine or machines, but you cannot shift the accountability away. So there will still need to be an accountability framework that goes back to the board and senior management of banks. They would be held accountable for AI-driven decisions and processes. At the end of the day, as a banking supervisors, we don't actually interrogate the machines or the models. We can't find them. We can't sort of take away the license of a model. We can take away the license of an individual, though. So we have to sort of make sure that accountability still goes back to the board and senior management of financial institutions. The other issue is about explainability of outcome, what we call the black box risk, because by the time certain outcome comes out from the AI engine, it might have gone through like 100 different iterations of processing of the data points. And therefore, how do you actually explain why certain outcome is where they are? You don't have to, you may not be able to explain all the time to the customers on each and every occasion, but you have to be able to explain to the senior management who is being held accountable for that. Otherwise, it would be difficult for them to explain to the supervisors when they are being questioned. And therefore, explainability is important. And then I talked about ongoing review, ongoing training of the machine, and therefore proper validation before and after launch is important. So that's the first issue about governance and accountability in the areas of customer protection. Second principle is fairness. It has to produce objective, consistent, ethical, and fair outcomes to customers. And it has to comply with anti-discrimination law. So the inputs may not be discriminatory, but the outcome could be very discriminatory. I always use the examples that I learned from our US friends that there was some banks were using the credit risk modeling engine. And the engine actually discovered the night shifters actually perform worse in terms of repayment of loans. And therefore, the engine ended up with granting a lower sort of credit approval limits for night shifters. It turns out that night shifters are mostly colored people, in particular Black. And therefore, the outcome was actually discriminatory against the Black people in that locality. And as a result, it's not legal in a sense. So it's not designed to be discriminatory, but the outcome could actually be discriminatory. So the third principle is transparency and disclosure. You have to be, for example, sometimes I'm not sure whether the audience is aware, when you pick up the phone, you talk to a hotline, you might actually be just talking to an engine, a chatbot. So we require banks to make sure that if a customer is dialing in and talking to a machine, you better be transparent upfront with them that you are actually talking to a machine and not a human being. And of course, all that was actually geared towards the final principles of data privacy and protection in the areas of AI and machine learning. I think I've already overused my time, but let me just quote some, before I finish, let me just quote some numbers so that the audience will understand where things are heading in the banking sector. Ada mentioned in her presentation that 2 years ago, we actually published a statistic showing that 89%, 90% of retail banks have already adopted or are planning to implement artificial intelligence in business operations. By now, almost all retail banks in Hong Kong have already done that. And 3 years ago, we introduced what we call a supervisory sandbox. So banks can actually dump technology applications in our sandbox, not really fulfilling all the supervisory requirements, and test out certain technology solutions in the sandbox. Over the past 3.5 years, we had more than 200 tests conducted in the sandbox. More than half of those involve artificial intelligence applications. And more recently, that percentage is actually higher. And therefore, you can see that in terms of technological applications in the banking world, a very significant proportion of those are related to artificial intelligence. Things like client-facing chatbots, personalized advertisements, cybersecurity, remote onboarding, biometric identification, and more recently, more usages are in the areas of anti-money laundering and fraud detection controls. So probably, Emily, I should stop there. I just want to give the audience a very quick sort of overview of how I see the core parameters are, and also the where banks are heading in terms of this particular area of development. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you. Arthur, you actually summarized today's public lecture very, very well. And to pick up on the points made by three speakers today, I think safer to say that data and AI really is a game changer for the financial industry. And I especially want to pick up the last point addressed by our Singapore regulator on regulatory cooperation and coordination. And I want to extend the discussion at both local and international level, because it also echoes very well Arthur's point on risk management, risk assessment, as well as governance and accountability. And Arthur did a very good job to identify several risks, including AI model risk, cyber risk, contingency risk, and black market risk, so on and so forth. In fact, I think one of the audience would like to ask questions about that and address the questions to both Hong Kong and Singapore regulators. So just to elaborate a little bit more, I noted that Mr. Arthur Yuan has given public lectures before on RegTech, in which AI was mentioned a few times. And the connection between RegTech and AI is almost self-evident, as they both can be utilized to enhance regulatory compliance, regulatory reporting for, say, the MLCFT purposes, risk assessment, and transaction monitoring. On the other hand, the Insurance Authority has given seminars on InsurTech, which can be applied to make insurance contracts or settle insurance claims. For the business of the securities regulator, I can think of the example of robo-advisory services. It is safe to say that RegTech, InsurTech, and robo-advisors in one way or another involve data and AI. So the question is, can we expect A, joint actions made by multiple regulatory authorities for making investigations, or B, a handbook by them for providing guidance on regulatory observance, even though I spoke in the context of Hong Kong regulators, but I believe that the same question is relevant. The same question as regards regulatory cooperation and coordination is also relevant to Singapore's regulators and regulatees. So yeah, I hope that the three speakers today can enhance us with the understanding. Thank you.
Emily, can I just jump in on this one?
Yes, of course.
Yeah. On regulatory cooperation, there are two angles to it. First, local regulatory cooperation. In fact, about 2 years ago, we actually introduced what we call a single point of entry in terms of sandbox applications. So yes, we have actually observed that there are technology applications that would traverse different segments in the financial sector. In Hong Kong, unlike Singapore has MAS being a super regulator. Yeah. Here is sectoral regulators. So we recognize that we do need to coordinate better. Yes. In terms of the way we respond to these kind of things. So we do communicate a lot through the sandbox applications, as well as the day-to-day supervisory dialogues between the three of us, in order to ensure that the guidance that we give out in terms of things like when there's an AI applications in different areas, we better make sure that the supervisory guidance are coherent. And so, yes, we very much appreciate that there's a need for doing so. So if there are any feedbacks from the audience of things that could actually be done better in terms of coordination, do let us know. We stand ready to do that. That's the first angle. The other angle is actually increasingly we find that there is a need for cross-border cooperation as well, because the same application could actually be done in both Hong Kong and Singapore at the same time. And so how do we actually communicate better between ourselves and, for example, MAS Monetary Authority of Singapore, and also between the Privacy or Data Privacy Commission, between ourselves and the Privacy Commission Office, as well as with foreign sort of Privacy Commissioner's Office. That's something that we need to work on going forward as well.
Ada and Zikin.
Maybe I'll just go first.
Yes.
Sure.
Yes.
So I want to reinforce what Arthur has said. Over in Singapore, we look at it the same way as well. Yes, the Monetary Authority of Singapore runs a regulatory sandbox. PDPC runs one as well. But what's important is not so much the entry point, but the coordination at the back, right? So what we have is actually a regulators roundtable, right? That we meet and then we try and we develop some of these things through regulatory roundtable, a forum for us to discuss and get things done, right? And once you build a relationship, actually, you know who to call and how to coordinate. So that's really the key point. Cross-border regulatory sandboxes is something that we would like to explore as well, right? And be very, very interested to see whether we could do work on something with Hong Kong. But one of the big challenge, of course, is finding the right company that's intending to introduce the same product in two places. Because having the sandbox being available in the two jurisdictions is one of the lists you need to check off. Having companies that's introducing the same product, right, same feature in both jurisdictions is the other thing you need to check off, right? When both meet, then actually I think there's a huge potential here to show that like-minded regulators who are prepared to take a practical problem-solving mentality can actually be very progressive and supportive, right? Of making sure that technology can be introduced, but introduced in a way that's safe, right? And I want to emphasize in a practical way, so that the same internal compliance measure can satisfy the requirements of different jurisdictions. And that's where interoperability moves from concept to actual practice. I think in this area, regulatory cooperation in the form of enforcement and investigations, I don't think that we come across very much now, but I would say it's a matter of time. I would just end off by saying that in Singapore, we actually ended up having to deal with our framework in a very tangential manner in the context of a review application for access by a data subject, right? So the bank basically said that, oh, a lot of these algorithms are proprietary, so I can't tell you the full details and blah, but they actually had transparency statements that describe how data is used and how AI is used. And we found that actually having that kind of transparency statement was a good measure, right? That struck a good balance between actually giving full disclosure and sufficient transparency. So we came across that last year. I think that it's a matter of time before more of this is going to come up. And I think having the readiness to join hands across borders to work together on these issues is going to be important.
Yeah, I cannot agree more. Emily, I think for the regulators, basically we are facing similar risks, whether locally or internationally. And the development of AI has also posed similar challenges to our work. And that is why it's important for us to cooperate or collaborate together to consider the way forward. For my office, PCPD, we have been working with, for example, Commissioner Young's office, and we have plans to produce some reference materials in the form of handbooks, for example, for businesses both in Singapore and Hong Kong. And we have also been working with IA, the Insurance Authority, on organizing a big conference next year for the insurance sector, involving the Federation of Insurers as well. And AI will be, I think, a core subject in that particular conference. Internationally, we have been contributing to the work of a number of privacy organizations. I think later on in December this year, we will be also talking about AI in a conference of the Asia Pacific Privacy Assembly. So internationally, we have been working together. But I think the essential point at this particular juncture is not how to restrict. I will use the word restrict or regulate the development of AI, but rather to ascertain the risks and the challenges involved, and to facilitate the healthy development of AI as far as possible in order to unleash the potential of AI for the benefit of stakeholders, for the business sector. And when it comes to regulation, we will need to assess the risk involved, and we will need to adopt a very careful approach in regulating the development and the use.
Thank you very much to Singapore and Hong Kong regulators for this very, very enlightening public lecture. I want to exercise a little bit discretion. If you don't object to that, I'll feel very bad without addressing the questions from the audience. I noted that Ziking has kindly answered one question, and I'll read out the other two, and you can pick and choose whether you want to answer them. The first one, Ada mentioned that purpose of AI was important. Do you feel that the PICS,
the personal information collection statement,
thank you, is the right place to disclose the use of AI in Hong Kong? Or do you feel that additional disclosure is appropriate? The other question is it the opinion of the panelists that hard law regulation as being proposed in the EU is necessary to regulate the negative risks of AI technology?
Maybe I will start by answering the first question. I do believe that PICS, the personal information collection statement, is the starting point for disclosure. But on top of that, I will also encourage organizations to be as transparent as possible. For example, AIIFL has just mentioned that if a customer call the hotline, if the hotline is answered by the machine, you better tell the customer that it is answered by the machine in the first place to avoid complaints. And so it does not stop there. And I would encourage organizations to disclose more by other means, whether on their website or otherwise.
If I might just chip in on this, going back to the case I mentioned about the bank in Singapore, that actually what they did was that in addition to what we call our data protection policy, right, the PICS, right, in addition to that, they had, when they were using AI, they had a very specific, very short one-page write-up about how, for example, in that case, AI was used in credit scoring. And they just give a description of how the technology is used, when it is used, what data is used. So that kind of very purpose-written statement can be very clear and very useful, and given only to those people who request for it or who are affected by it. Or otherwise, you make it available on your website. So that's a very good way of providing the information.
Thank you, Ziking and Ada, for bringing today's public lecture to a perfect ending. I'm trespassing on your generosity, all of you, including the three regulators, as well as the audience. We are running a little bit over time, but this is where we should end. Thank you so much. And I'm sure that we will touch base again. Thank you so much again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Emily.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Okay,
Thank
bye-bye.
you for joining us.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.